when we're talking about hospice care, we're talking about time to death.
What do you think are some of the most common misconceptions people have about hospice care?
We don't talk about death in our society. We don't have the language necessarily. We certainly often don't have the experience.
What is the importance of end-of-life care?
It's important because it means that...
Hello and welcome to Your Retirement Planning Simplified. I am one of your hosts, Lindsay Wilson, and today I am welcoming Red Keating, a supportive care counselor at Hospice Peterborough, co-host of the podcast, What Now? We're talking to Red about hospice care in Peterborough. Retirement Planning Simplified has fundraised for Hospice's annual Hike for Hospice, and this year was also a sponsor for this special event, and it's something we get involved in every year. And I want to welcome Red to the show and have a really helpful conversation about hospice care here in our community and what it is. So just to start, I would love to let people know, because some of our listeners might not know, what is hospice care?
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for having me on.
Yeah.
Hospice care and palliative care kind of sometimes get used interchangeably. And there's many things that are the same about those two things. But hospice care it's really, when we're talking about hospice care, we're talking about time to death. And so when it comes to hospice care, we're really looking at all other treatment options have been exhausted. There's no cure, and treatment has been deemed as something that is not helping anymore. And that the person is actually now on the trajectory toward their death. And so there's usually a sense of time frame around hospice, 6 months kind of thing. But inside hospice, we do good palliative care work. Palliative care, good palliative care hopefully starts from the moment of diagnosis of a life-threatening illness. But hospice care is really that end stage care. And that time when all the sort of medical attempts at treatment have been exhausted.
And I wonder if you could, and this is a broad question, I realize, but I wonder if you could speak to what is the importance of end-of-life care for a community, for Ontario? What is the importance of end-of-life care?
Right. Well, I mean, it is so important. We think about, I always talk about how we spend at least 9 months getting ready to bring a life into the world. And we have celebrations and parties and gift giving. And it's a very joyous time. And we spend a lot of time getting ready for that event coming into the world. Hospice care is that time when we say, hey, we also need to take some care because this is another important time of life. And that's the leaving of life. And it's important because it means that sometimes people say when treatment is over, like I think one of the worst things a doctor can say to somebody is there's nothing more we can do for you. And hospice care allows for that care and dignity of the person to manage whatever issues they're experiencing as they're coming to the end of their life, whether that be a symptom of pain, a symptom maybe of nausea, some kind of issue that the medicine hasn't given up on them. And so I think it's important to say that you're still important to the system. It's just that the trajectory has changed and the goal has changed. But that there are still really good qualified people here to support and help you through this process of your life coming to an end.
And I would love to just get an idea of what motivated you to pursue a career in hospice care. What led you to it?
I've always said I've Winnie the Pooh'd my way through my career. It just seemed to present itself. I always go back to when I was young. I come from a very large extended family, and we would have 2 or 3 deaths a year. It seemed in my growing up years, and we were always at the funeral home. And then one of my high school jobs was working in a funeral home.
Really?
Yeah, which was a rather unique job for someone in grade 11 or 12.
A unique job for anyone, really, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't meet many people who work at funeral homes, but yeah.
It was a great education.
Yeah.
And, some very interesting experience happened then. I went to school and became a social worker. And then a position opened up at the old St. Joe's Hospital here in Peterborough, if people remember. And I became the social worker for the palliative care unit when it opened at St. Joe's. And there was just a fit. I don't know how else to explain it. It was just like, oh, wow, this is work that makes sense to me. And it felt really natural. Now, I didn't have the opportunity. I didn't stay with it for my entire career. I've done some other things. But after I retired, I found my way back to hospice. And again, it just feels like the right fit. And I don't know how else to explain it, but it feels natural and normal. And I think that it's work where you feel like, you get a sense that you're really helping people by supporting them through this process.
Absolutely.
And I should say the person and their families, right? So
that's actually something that I think is worth addressing, is that hospice care, of course, is primary care for the person who is facing their end of life. But maybe we could just talk briefly about the support that you offer to the family around that person.
Yeah, caregiver support is that's a pretty good portion of my workload, is supporting the folks who are living with somebody with a life-threatening illness. And so because they're also going through an important life event that's very difficult and is going to end in a place where they don't want to be, right? And it's exhausting. And those folks also need support so that they know that they're not alone. So we'll take on the family if that's what's asked. I do a lot of support, and some of my colleagues here also do a lot of support of family members. We do a lot of that work, and that too is rewarding, because you are supporting someone. They're on a ride and they can't get off of it. And they can feel very alone and isolated as their world constricts, as the disease progresses, and who their loved one is loses that sense of physical functioning. And it's 24 hours a day. There's no break from it. So, we do a lot of that work with folks.
What would you say is, or if you have examples, or it could be a more general example, could you share some of your work's most rewarding and challenging aspects?
Well, rewarding is just the privilege and the honor of being invited into people's lives at an incredibly significant and vulnerable time. I mean, that's a huge honor. And I find in situations like this, if you're working well and you create trust gets created hopefully relatively quickly, because of course there is a shorter timeline, but it's also highly emotionally charged, right? And so just that being there, and then almost being seen as, and I don't want to say integral, but that a good sidecar, if you're a good sidecar to journey with this person through that, to that point, you make those connections really quickly, and they're actually quite deep, which then also becomes some of the more challenging parts, isn't it? Natural, is that it's not a job where you don't not get attached, if you know what I mean. And so you always have to be aware of your own sense of carrying the grief and carrying that struggle yourself when you go home, right? And so that's a challenge. And then the other biggest challenge is the demand, the ability to meet the demand, right? But I'd say the biggest reward is just that sense of honor to be, it's a privilege to be invited into people's lives and at such an important and integral time.
Would you say there's any challenging aspects that you faced in your career working in hospice care?
Well, I guess that the challenge is sometimes you don't want to push a person accidentally or unwittingly into an area of conversation and a feeling that they're not ready to be in yet. And so it's really the challenge of listening and taking the time to let the individual sort of drive the bus and really follow where they're at, as opposed to push them. Now, sometimes a little push here and there, once trust is developed, is not a bad thing. But that sense of making sure that you are staying where the person is, that you are not sort of overlaying, like I'm not overlaying what I think this answer to the situation is, or what I think the way they should think, the way I think they should think doesn't matter. and how they think. So it's a challenge, it's just to stay in that place of openness. But the folks make that easy. You know what I mean? But that's still a challenge to make sure that you're not sort of overlaying and I mean, like getting close to people.
Yeah.
But the beautiful thing is you get to cry.
Yeah.
It's the only job where I really felt like, wow, you can cry. Because if you're sitting across from someone and you've really developed a relationship with that person, and you've talked about some pretty good and intimate things, and it's been several months, and that person's dying, and that's a challenge to make sure that you are reading yourself well and making sure that you're giving yourself time to grieve.
Yeah, because you are. It's natural that you've walked this journey with that person.
Yeah. And by no means I feel like I'm the family, because I mean that's where the grief really is. But sort of from that professional place, you do get attached, and so you're getting attached to someone who is going to die, and so you take that. I guess that's a bit of a professional risk in terms of our own well-being and mental health, is to know that you are a companion on this journey, so to speak, but you know where the journey ends. And so you have to give you, and you know what happens is the folks at hospice are so supportive. We just support each other, right? And so that you've got places to fall back.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I just would love to return to the idea of conversations with families and patients. Do you have, I'm sure every approach every situation is different, but how do you approach conversations with families and patients regarding end of life decisions?
Openly, and invitingly. I think that's one of the things, is that we don't talk about death in our society. I sort of said it, we prepare for 9 months for a birth. We don't have the language necessarily. We certainly often don't have the experience. And so just being open to say, hey, I'm somebody who is willing to have that conversation with you, and all those thoughts that you've been having in your head, that you felt maybe uncomfortable or awkward to share, I'll listen to those. Let's talk about those things, because those are the most important. But I always generally start by saying, so what are we going to do? Where do you want to go? Where are you at right now? What are you thinking? What are you feeling about what's happening in your life? And that just sort of generally gets the ball rolling. But the place that I always go to is, one, develop trust, and two, be open to say, this is a safe place to have the conversation that you might have only ever had in your head, to talk about the fears or the things that nobody else wants to talk about. This is a safe place to talk about them here. Yeah.
Oh, no, please, if you.
Well, I think I was just going to repeat myself, so I'll stop.
So I'd love to now just to pull back a little bit and take a sort of a broader look at hospice care. And what do you think are some of the most common misconceptions people have about hospice care?
Yeah. Is that they're just going to get dropped by the healthcare system, and that by medicine, and that they're just going to be sent home and be forgotten and left to their own devices. And I think that's one of the biggest surprises people get who aren't familiar with hospice care and palliative care, is that they come into this place that it just opens their arms to them, and they meet this incredible crew of people who are human. And I think that's the other piece that drew me to the work, is it's the most human work I've done. And that's a strange thing to say, but it is, right straight to the core of our existence and our humanity, is I'm alive, I'm not alive, and I'm a person and you're a person, and we're going to meet on that level. And they realize that when they come into hospice, they go, actually, a family just recently I was talking to, they were really anxious about coming to hospice, because of course that meant I'm dying, right? And they knew they were dying before they got here, but they just thought, where are we going? Why wouldn't we go to the hospital? Why are we here? And they got here, and before the end of the day, they were like, oh my gosh, why didn't we come here sooner? And now I'm sort of espousing or spouting off about the wonderful people here at hospice. They are just wonderful people,
Yeah.
and you just sort of are enveloped in this incredible arms of support. And I remember on one of our podcasts, we interviewed our medical director.
Mm-hmm.
And as he got talking and I was sitting there kind of going, yeah, wow. And I think I said it in the podcast, there's a doctor behind that human somewhere, you know? And I know that's Dr. Chris Blake. And I
Mm-hmm.
know when my dad was dying, Chris came to my mom and dad's place and spent an hour and a half with them. And he did one of the best things he could have done. My dad was a great joke teller. And at the end, my dad had some speech issues from a small stroke. But he told a joke, my dad did. And then he pointed it at Dr. Blake and said, now it's your turn to tell a joke. And he didn't miss a beat. And this is after an hour and a half of just sitting down and talking to a person, not about, only about medicine. And he told a joke. And I remember talking to Chris afterward. I said, that's the best thing you could have ever done. And I mean, Dad loved him from there on in.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's palliative care. Good palliative care, good hospice care is good human care, right? And I don't know if I've gone off on some kind of crazy tangent there, but
no, it's wonderful.
It's that the care stops. It's still medical care, but it stops being medicalized, if that makes any sense. And it says the human comes first. And so the support and care that come from that perspective is amazing. It also starts from the place that says we know and accept that this individual or that you are going to die. Let's start there. Let's look at that. Let's not run away from that. Let's not put that in the shadows, hide it, somewhere away in a cupboard. Let's start there. And what do you need? Right. And so I've been in rooms with people, and our chef has come in and said to the individual, I says, I'm going to the grocery store. What would you like? I mean, that's amazing. Right? And everybody here, whether you're a nurse, whether you're the custodian, whether you're a person like myself, or you're a doctor, it all starts with that place of meeting people right at where they're at that human level. And then the skill and the medical comes after that. And that flip, I think, is really noticeable. So when people get here, it alleviates all their fears. Not all of them, of course, but it allows them to relax. It allows them to settle into the environment relatively quickly. And we are so fortunate in Peterborough to have the palliative care services at the hospital and to have hospice here.
100%. How does your team work? And I guess we are treading some ground we've already touched on, but how does your team work to provide emotional and spiritual support to patients and their families? And one of the things I was thinking we could talk about and let listeners know about is some of the support groups that Hospice Peterborough offers.
Right. Well, yes, we start at that emotional level, so I think we've sort of done that. The concept of spiritual care is a really interesting thing, because if a person comes in with a specific sort of, let's say, spiritual direction or religious sort of background, then we it's asked, and if they have people in their lives who have been sort of spiritual directors or guiders or a priest or a rabbi or whoever, they're more than welcome to have them come into hospice, whenever they want them. And that's okay. And if they say, I haven't been, in my religion for very long, but I wouldn't mind speaking to this particular person, whether a priest or something like that, then we'll arrange for that to happen. So we'll connect with whatever the religious sort of affiliation they might be attached to, and we'll connect with that, and we'll get someone to come in here and talk to them. If some are having more just that philosophical, existential discussion, quite often myself, I would have a conversation like that with somebody, or my colleague Cheryl would do the same. And so for the spiritual care needs, if we don't step outside and work outside our own sort of area of expertise, and if that's the case, then we'll connect with the community and get that person in here. And what was the other? It was sort of the spiritual.
Oh,
And
I was just thinking how Hospice Peterborough provides emotional and spiritual support, but also just to touch upon there are some groups that you offer as well, support
the groups.
groups.
Yeah. So I guess we have sort of our moving through grief. I guess I'll start with grief chat.
Mm-hmm.
Grief work is a particularly interesting thing in that we always say you should be at least 4 to 6 months post the death before you start doing grief work. And all of our grief work is done in groups. And so everybody sort of wants to start immediately, or sometimes there's that urge to want to start immediately. And we always say, take about 4 to 6 months. And then people come back and go, oh my gosh, I'm ever glad I waited. You were so right. Because when it's so raw and so new, you're not ready to hear the information that you're going to get in a group, right? And there's so much other work to do with it. The business of dying, all of that stuff you have to do with the government and, pensions and stuff like that. And then there's just the emotional settling in. And it takes 4 to 6 months for that sort of shock and, that newness to wear off and kind of go, okay, this is my life now, right? Because grief isn't about getting over the loss. It's about learning how to live with it. It's learning how to build a different life than what you're expecting, and learning how to carry that loss with you into that new life. And so we have grief chat, which is a phone in. Grief, it's whoever phones in, it happens. We have a sort of a 3-part grief series, moving through your grief, which sort of has a group. There's the level 1, level 2, and level 3. That's the one that sort of that generalized grief folks might be directed toward. We started a new one sort of called Grieving Their Absence, which is for overdose deaths. There was no one in Peterborough doing that right now, and so we've just sort of started a little pilot project to see if what the response is going to be and to see how that goes. We have survivors of suicide loss. We have a bereaved parents group. We have Mindful Nourishment, which is a virtual meditation group. We have the Adult Recovery Series for those who have graduated from Grief Group 1 and 2, sort of move into 3, and that's more loose. It's less. It's not so structured. Becoming Me After a Loss group. Trying to figure out who we are. We also have children's groups. We have a children, family, and child specialist on staff who does all the teen and children work. And so she has a children's group and a teen group as well.
Right. That's amazing. What a great amount of offerings for people at various stages, right? In different experiences.
It sounds like a mouthful for such a small little organization, but yeah, it gets done.
It's incredible.
Yeah. I guess. Oh, sorry. We also have groups for a women's group and a men's group for those people who are living with a life-threatening illness.
Right.
And so it's a sort of a support group, self-directed. It's not like a therapy group. It's just getting those folks together that want to come together and talk and share how living with their life-threatening illness is, how it's doing.
Absolutely. So, one of the questions I'd love to ask is, in your experience, what is the most meaningful way for families to be present during a loved one's final days?
You answered your question in the question. It is just to be present.
Yeah.
If the person is, let's say, whatever symptom they're having, it's usually pain, creates a situation where there's palliative sedation. So the person is asleep. The level of pain medication required means that they are asleep. Then being present is all that you can do. Right? Some folks eventually, some folks are more talkative as the journey goes along, but there's going to be that point where the talking stops usually. And we do a lot of this. In fact, we have our own podcast just on being present and the importance of being present. And it sounds like such an inept thing to do, or some kind of, it sounds limp. But being present and to witness is one of the toughest and most important pieces of work that anybody will ever do.
Mm.
I say to people, all you do is sit there in the chair all day and you're exhausted because it is so difficult just to sit and witness. But that's what the work is at the end, right? You are sort of chaperoning that person out of this world. You are staying by their side. You are holding their hand. You are, putting a cloth on their head. You're kissing their forehead. You are doing the things that say, you're not alone. I'm here. But it is incredibly difficult work because it looks like you're doing nothing, but you're preparing to say goodbye to someone you love, right? And it can feel very impotent, like you can't do any. It feels like you're not doing anything. And time starts to change and how it goes by. And your sense of connection to the outside world, I always look out a window when I say those kinds of, there's all of a sudden, there's that world out there that's happening and it just continues to happen. But my world is this room, it's this bed, it's the person in the bed. And my job now is to witness and journey to the end. And it's exhausting. But that's what you do. You answer the question with the question. Is the only thing left to do is to be present. And it is so important to be present. Because it's an amazing thing. And you ask people, have you ever been with someone when they die? And most people say they don't. And it is an incredibly sacred time. And that moment is incredibly sacred. I don't know if there's a better word for that. It's like, wow, that veil between living and dying and being alive and being dead is so thin. It's to be there and witness and be present when that happens is incredibly sacred, and it's incredibly difficult work.
Again, I'd like to sort of back us out and take more of a wide angle or wide lens view of hospice. And I would love, I know it's, we for listeners, Red and I chatted a bit before we started recording about the structure of hospice care in Canada. And of course it is provincial and community based. So we're going to talk about Peterborough because that's where we are. But how would you say hospice care is typically is structured in Peterborough regarding accessibility or services, that sort of thing?
Right. Yeah. Well, I would. Peterborough is this strange little anomaly. We have a really good system here for palliative and hospice care in Peterborough. I would say some of the best, one of the best in the province. Like you said earlier, the funding, it's part provincial and then it's part donations. That's sort of the funding model. It's not 100% funded. And so the shortfall is made up through donations. And every community has organized their hospice care around their own needs. So every community, it's different. And so unlike the healthcare system, when you go through, you expect it to sort of be the same all over the province. When it comes to hospice care, it's different throughout each community. And if you live in a larger community, or an urban community, it's a little bit more accessible. We talked about the fact that sometimes maybe in northern Ontario or in rural areas, access might be a little more limited. We cover, a large area, Peterborough and County. But sometimes you get out into some rural communities and it might be a little sparse. But because it's each community sort of manages it and has organized it in their own way, it's different throughout the province. But in Peterborough, I think we have the Cadillac of palliative and hospice service with the hospital, the palliative care unit of the hospital, and with hospice here. So access to hospice it's usually a physician to physician referral. And so you just have to get a referral from a doctor who will then refer you to a hospice, and then you'll be covered by a hospice physician as well, or a palliative care physician. They're both our hospice physicians, our palliative care physicians. They work here and the hospital.
Right. And so there's that line, not a line between the two, but there's that relationship between the two that we talked about at the beginning, hospice and palliative, right?
Yes. Yeah. In the palliative world, you can still be in active treatment, right?
Right.
In the hospice world, all the treatment has stopped.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I thank you very much for being on the show. I just wondered if you had any final thoughts or messages you'd like to share with our listeners, especially those who may be looking at a life-threatening illness or supporting someone with a life-threatening illness, or are thinking about, a loved one in hospice care.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the thing is to reach out
Mm-hmm.
and not feel alone and isolated. Usually by the time you get to the place where you're in the care of hospice, you will have been well medicalized, or you have been, you've been well experienced, and you have seen how end of life care and whatever it is that's causing that, whether it might be cancer or COPD or whatever it is, you've been well entrenched in the medical system, and sometimes that's a really good experience, and sometimes that's not so great. Hospice care and palliative care, from my experience, has always been an incredibly good experience. And so reach out, don't be alone, because there's no need to be alone, and because it's such a difficult time. The work is exhausting, and the support is here. So I would say, don't go through it alone. People often hear the word palliative care. Like I said earlier, good palliative care starts at the time of diagnosis. But people hear that palliative or hospice and they think, that's the end of life. People have given up on me. And that's not necessarily the case. Good palliative care allows space for treatment modalities, allows space for curative treatment. It allows space for palliative treatment. It just says that we're going to try to take care of this person as a whole. Good hospice care says we're here when that treatment is over. It was unsuccessful, but you are still important. You still require care and support, and we are here to provide that. So, it's a continuum.
And for everybody listening, I will include a link to Red's podcast, What Now, as well as the website, Peterborough Hospice website, just for anybody who's curious about what we do here at hospice, what happens here in our community in Peterborough for hospice care. And thank you very much, Red, for taking the time to speak with us today.
And thank you very much for having me. And if I could just say, Julie Brown and David Kennedy are my other co-hosts on the podcast.
Of course.
I could not do what I do without all the other people here who work at hospice. It's just such an incredible team, so supportive. And we appreciate you asking us to come and speak with you, Lindsay. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to stop it there.